This is part two of the chapter one lecture note. There we go. Okay, and we left off on this page um, discussing the differences between inductive and deductive reasoning. And I was telling you, the last thing that I was explaining to you is that the conclusion that was drawn in the inductive reasoning example is basically the theory of natural selection or survival of the fittest. So that is a theory or a general premise. The general premise in this case is an actual theory. Doesn't have to be, but in this case it is. So for the deductive reasoning example, the theory of natural selection is used as the general premise to predict results. So the predicted results here are if the average temperature in an ecosystem increases due to climate change, individuals better adapted to warmer temperatures will outcompete those that are not. These are predicted results. More than likely, because of the fact that we have studied the theory of natural selection for many, many years, and there is have been lots of experiments done and lots of observations made. More than likely, these predicted results would come true if the climate changed and the average temperature went up, for a period of time. Then you would see species adapting to that. You would see species changing and adapting to species that were more adapted to the higher temperature, would be the ones to outcompete and survive um, over the ones that weren't as able to adapt. So that didn't have, characteristics to where they could survive the higher temperatures. So anyway, this is just one example of inductive and deductive reasoning, or two examples. And just to point out, the conclusion sometimes from the inductive reasoning can often become the premise for, this should be deductive. That is a mistake. Deductive reasoning. And the scientific method, of course, uses both. It uses deductive reasoning here and here. When we form hypotheses and make predictions, we are using deductive reasoning. And then when we draw conclusions, we are using, which is here at this step, whether or not the hypothesis is supported or not supported, that is inductive reasoning. So in the scientific method, we typically follow this series of steps, usually in this same order. The first thing that we'll do is make one or more observations that lead us to ask a question. And the question is a problem that we'd like to find the answer to, we'd like to solve. So what is not mentioned, it was not shown in this list, is before we formulate our hypothesis to answer a suggested explanation or a suggested answer to the question, we're probably going to do some research. But after that, gathering as much information as we can, we're going to formulate a hypothesis that answers the question. And then we're going to make a prediction. We're going to predict what will happen when we experiment, when we do an experiment to test the hypothesis. So we're going to formulate a hypothesis, make a prediction, and then we're going to actually do an experiment, a controlled experiment, to test the prediction. And we will analyze the results. We'll record the data and the results, and we'll analyze them. And after analyzing the results, we'll draw our conclusion. which is step 7. And that conclusion will either be that the hypothesis is supported by the results or it is not supported. Then step 8 would be to report the results. If this were, depending on whether or not this was an experiment that you just did at your house, for not for like a scientific journal or for a university level or anything like that, um, you might report the results to your family or to yourself, or you might, if you're a scientist, you're actually doing research and uh, scientific research that is someone would be interested in reading, you would report it to, a scientific journal or, to a scientific website or something like that. But you would report it to the scientific community or the world. Um, there are two types of science, and we're kind of changing topics here, but um, and we use both of these sciences in biology. Biology, we sometimes use basic science and sometimes applied science in biology. But whenever we are using basic science is just has the purpose of um, seeking knowledge, expanding our knowledge. So basic science is considered pure science. Um, Applied science is using that knowledge to solve a problem. It's the use of that knowledge, that basic science, to solve problems. So in biology, um, basic science, for example, we will study genetics in Bio 111. That will come toward the end of the course, or toward the middle. It's when we'll start studying genetics. And of course, the molecule that contains our genetic code or our genes is DNA. So the study of DNA and how DNA codes for, um, or how DNA, I'm sorry, the DNA code actually works, how genes actually code for our traits or individual proteins. That's basic science. But then we use that science sometimes. Applied science is when we create transgenic organisms. Or when we use DNA fingerprinting to solve crimes in forensic science or in paternity cases. So those are just a few examples, but that's the difference between basic and applied. Um, Scientists who want their work known to the world have to go through a process called peer review. We don't just come up with scientific theories based on random experiments that people do. And there's a process to it, and it's basically, if you've ever heard the term devil's advocate, playing devil's advocate, that's what we try to do in science. We try to actually disprove the results until we just can't find an argument to disprove the results anymore. The argument for that theory being true is so strong that we can't find anything to disprove it. So this process of peer review is very rigorous. Um, so peer review involves a blind process whereby scientists submit the details of their experiment, results, interpretations, and reviewers determine the veracity and merit of that work for publication. And these papers that scientists submit typically follow a format of these peer-reviewed papers will typically have an abstract, which is like a summary, and then they'll have an introduction, their methods that explains how the experiment was conducted. Their results will be listed in a form that is easy to read, hopefully, like in either tables or graphs or, some organized way. And then there'll be a discussion of the results, and they'll cite any literature that they used in their research um, to help them to design their experiment and, to help them in their process of formulating their conclusions. This is figure 1.8, which is a photograph of a brown pelican, a rescued brown pelican. Um, this this photograph is from 2008. It's a brown pelican that was rescued by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service after Hurricane Ike struck the Gulf Coast. And it's an example of applied science because um, after learning the basic science of what pelicans need and what they need to be healthy and survive in the wild, scientists were able to rehabilitate the bird and reintroduce the pelican back into the wild. And that would be applied science. Now we're moving on to, um, since this is biology, the study of living things, we're going to talk about the properties that all living things have in common. So what properties do all living things share, no matter what type of living thing it is, from a bacterium, which is just a single-celled organism, to a human, which is, well, trillions of cells, basically. So the properties that all living things share is that they have a certain order, certain organization. Um, they have a sensitivity or response to stimuli. Um, some smaller organisms or plants will respond to light, for example. Um, we respond to pain, you know, um, in different ways. We might, we might say a bad word or something, or if we touch something that causes us pain, we'll pull our hand away. Um, but there are different examples of responses to stimuli. And then living things are always capable, the species is capable of reproducing, um, producing offspring. Growth, getting bigger, and development are basically life stages. And then regulating is related to this process of regulation and homeostasis are basically interrelated. But homeostasis is the maintenance of internal conditions within a narrow range, and then energy processing. Um, Different living things do this in different ways. Plants carry out photosynthesis, and consumers, such as animals, carry out cellular respiration in their cells in order to convert the food that they eat into energy. So these are the different properties that living things have. And this is just the most beautiful toad I have ever seen, I think. Um, but it's definitely looks like it would give you warts if you touched it. It looks like it's covered with warts. But it's an example of a living thing, and all living things are organized. They have an organized structure. They consist of, actually, even before cells, they consist of atoms and molecules and little parts inside the cells called organelles. And then they're composed of individual cells, and those cells form tissues, and those tissues form organs like the heart and the brain and the liver. And then those organs form organ systems like the urinary system, the circulatory system.